What's up everyone? In this video, we're going to work on extending the PayloadCMS config file. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Now let's dive in. In my last video, we got started with the bare minimum requirement for the PayloadCMS config, but there's so much more we can do with the payload config. So here over on this screen is the bare minimum. But payload by its design is config-based and code-first, and that means that you will need to manually add much of the functionality you would like your PayloadCMS instance to have. While that sounds like a hassle if you're in a rush or you're new to PayloadCMS, the level of flexibility this allows you to have over your CMS flow is unparalleled. The config can feel deep and daunting, but interacting with your configuration will be simple and intuitive. If you don't already have a payload project set up, go back to my Getting Started with PayloadCMS and Getting Started with MongoDB for PayloadCMS videos, and watch those before continuing on with this video. We've already set up a new project in PayloadCMS, and we've already set up a new MongoDB for PayloadCMS, so all of what I'm about to go through now is going to be new material from those videos. And so there are so many options available to you in your payload config. For the sake of this video though, we're only going to walk through a couple of them. And the first is the admin option. And so here you can see that we already have an admin option here because that is part of payload's default and bare minimum config. This allows you to configure options for your main admin panel. Here you can set things like the collection you'd like to use for allowing users to log in. You can select your default date format. You can define custom components, add metadata, which we'll cover in a later video, and even disable the entire admin panel if you wanted to. Let's take a look at a few of these options, starting with the user option. This is the field that you can use to indicate which collection you want people to log in from. This comes in handy when you want a separate people type collection like author, but you want to keep authors separate from admin users. In order for this to work, you should set auth true in the collection with which you would like to enable authentication. Here, let me show you. So if we go over to our users collection, which is right here, you'll see here in the collection config, we have auth set to true. This tells the payload config that you can use this users collection to log people in. There's not much to expand on here in this field, but when we talk about access control later, you can set different permissions at the user level to gain even more control over how people access the admin panel. Now, date format. You can select a default date format using any valid date FNS format pattern. So for example, if you want to change from the default PayloadCMS date format, you can define the date format option as something like month, day, and year to change how the date is rendered within your PayloadCMS admin panel. So let's do that real quick. We have our date format. That needs to be in the admin here. And we're going to set our date format to be month, month, day, day, year, year, year. And so we save that, and I have our payload instance running over here. And if I go, I can see our date format is month, day, and year. And so I should be able to change this to something like this and see it reflected here at the updated at and created at. This comes in handy if you want a fully custom way to represent dates, or you want to handle a date differently than PayloadCMS does. People all handle dates differently, so it's nice to have the flexibility here. The next config option we'll talk about is the editor. This is how you set your default rich text editor in PayloadCMS, and Payload does prefer Lexical editor for new projects, but you can also choose Slate if you'd like to. Either way, keep in mind that you'll need to not only install the package, you'll need to import the editor from Payload in order to define your default editor. When we set up this project, we already had Lexical editor installed. So let's say we wanted to add Slate editor. What we can do is first, we need to end the server process here, and then we're going to do npm add. And then if we follow the example up here, we have at PayloadCMS rich text slate. And when we do this, it's going to run through its process. And as soon as Slate Editor is installed, we can then import our Slate Editor from PayloadCMS rich text Slate. And so when we import Slate Editor and include it as an editor, we do need to pass arguments, but those arguments can be blank. So for this project though, we're going to keep Lexical Editor, so I'm going to remove Slate Editor here and just replace this with Lexical Editor and clear out any plugins that I'm not going to use. The next option we'll talk about is DB. DB, standing for database, is a required field and can be MongoDB, Postgres, or SQLite. You will need to import whichever adapter you would like to use in order to define the database your project will use. You should also put the database connection string in an environment variable to protect it. Watch my Getting Started with MongoDB for PayloadCMS to see how to get your own hosted database. Choose whichever database you feel comfortable with using, but I typically default to MongoDB for PayloadCMS projects. The main benefit I saw of Postgres or SQLite is that it's easier to handle relationships in SQL databases, but PayloadCMS handles all of that for me with a MongoDB database, so I just use what's easier to spin up. If you don't know which database to use, or if you're new to this whole process, just use MongoDB until you're able to make a better determination in the future. We set this up in my MongoDB video, but we'll set this up again here using the payload blank template. So if we come over here, we can see our DB mongoose adapter URL and this environment variable database underscore URI. If this is undefined, it'll return an empty string, which will of course break the project. Now, when we delete DB, it breaks the payload config because it's expecting DB as a required option. So I'm going to type in DB, and we know we're using MongoDB for this. So I'm going to use my mongoose adapter and pass it an argument. Now there's a whole slew of arguments we can pass here, but the only one that we need to pass is URL, which we can do by just typing in URL and then accessing our environment variable called database URI. And if that's undefined, the two vertical pipes means or. If that's undefined, it'll return an empty string, of course, breaking the backend. Now the next option we need to cover is collections. Collections is an array of objects used to define what sections of a site you want. For example, you can have a pages and a blog collection, as well as a collection for your media uploads and marketing material. The blank payload template includes users and media already in your collections, but the options are endless. You can define them. You can either define the collections in your config or in a separate file to then be imported back into your config. It's recommended that you do the latter so your collection stays separated from your config, but we'll go over how to create collections in a separate file later, and for the sake of this example, I'll show you how to get one up in your config file. Each collection has its own config options, and we'll get into more detail with those later, but we'll start with the required fields, which are slug and fields. The slug is an identifier of the collection, and it expects a non-empty string. This is what's used to label your collection as well, but you can override this using the labels option. The slug is usually enough if you're just adding a post collection, but if you wanted to use blog as the slug and post as the label, you could do that like this. So let's go ahead and add a new collection to this array. And just to give us a little bit more space, it does need to be an object. And so we're going to add slug, and we'll say that we're going to add a posts slug. And then we're going to add labels, where we're going to pass another object, where we're going to have singular, and we're going to have plural. So our plural is going to be blogs, and our singular is going to be blog. Now it's still broken because we haven't passed through all of the required fields, which the last one will be fields. And here we're just gonna pass in a text field. So we'll do name, title works, and then we can do type, we'll do text field. Now when I save this and go back over to our admin and reload, we'll see over here we have a blogs collection. Now, one thing you should realize is that the labels is case sensitive. That's why we're seeing a lowercase blogs instead of an uppercase like the users and the media. If I change plural to capital and singular to capital and save that, we should then see blogs get correctly cased there. The fields option is used to define what materials make up the collection, and we'll dive into those fields later on. But just using this text field is enough to get us set up and started so you can see the blog posts in action. Once those fields are set, you have a new collection that you can expand upon. Globals are similar to our regular collections here. You can define global collections using the global option in your config. So we're going to go above collections and just type in globals. And this is also going to expect an array. It'll be an array of collections that are global in nature. These function like collections, but without the ability to add multiple globals, like you would be able to add multiple blogs to your blog collection. This comes in handy if you want to add fields you can edit like trackers or navigation links, but without having to create a bunch of individual collection items. Again, you can and should create globals in individual files to then be imported into your config file, but we'll cover that later on. For now, let's create a global config in your payload config file. So we just added the globals array here, and we're going to add, again, it needs to be an object, and we're going to add a global config called nav. So we're going to use slug, we're going to call it nav. And again, we can use labels here to show something other than nav, which is not very descriptive in what we want to say. So we can just set label to navigation, which is how it'll show up on the back end. And so now the reason that we don't see singular and plural here is because we can't have plural navs. It's a singular nav, and we're just changing how that singular nav is displayed in PayloadCMS. Now we need to add fields. So fields, just like in regular collections, is a required field here in globals. So if we type in fields and we put in an array, which is what is expected, and then we need to include an object in those fields. And so what we want to do is create a name of items, which is going to be of type array, which we can then pass in more fields where we'll put in just the name of the link. So we'll say name is link, and then we'll put in type of text. So now when I save this and come over here, I see my globals navigation. Now to show you a little bit more about what I meant with the label, if I edit this, it's just going to set this to nav, which again is just not very descriptive. So if I add navigation back, we're able to see very clearly that that's what that means. But if I go to it now, I can add a new item, and then I can just keep adding items. And this is different than how it would be for a blog, because this is all just one collection in the navigation. There's no way to access individual fields. But if I go and create a new blog, it's going to be a whole collection on its own. So we see here that I can go in and now edit this. But if I go back to navigation, all of the links are just available to me right away. The next setting we're going to cover is a CORS setting, or cross-origin resource sharing, which allows you to accept incoming requests from a whitelist of domains. Typically, you will want to at least allow your local host and your actual domains that you'll be hosting the site on. This will help you communicate seamlessly between your front end and back end. It's a good idea to put your primary domain as an environment variable so it can be set when you deploy, instead of having to change the code after you deploy. This is helpful when you don't know what the domain is going to be ahead of time, like when using Vercel, Railway, or DigitalOcean domain names. If you think you're experiencing issues from CORS, you have the ability to include a wildcard string, an asterisk, to accept all incoming requests. It's not very secure though, and you should always try to make CORS work. Only use the wildcard for troubleshooting. And so to enable CORS, you're gonna just type in CORS, and you can either do the wildcard string like this. You can also include your local host, and then your example domain name. If you don't know your domain, you can also just do process.env. We'll just say domain name, which is a made up environment variable. I'm going to add it by going to my environment variable off screen, because it is private information and you do not want to share your environment variable ever. And so now you can see if I hover over my IDE, I have domain name equals https example.com. Now you'll notice here that this is red underlined, which means there's an error. This can't be undefined. So what I will do is add the double vertical pipe again to say that if this is undefined, return an empty string so that this is not undefined. You can also use an object to set your core's configuration option. This object accepts origins, which can, again, be an array of whitelisted domains or a wildcard string. The other option the core's object will expect is an array of allowed headers. This is a more advanced option that you may not need, but know it's available should you need the option, and I'll show you how to do that very quickly. So if I do cores, and then I do an object, where we will have origins, and we'll have this as an array, which I'll just use the wildcard string, and then we'll do headers, which will accept X custom header. And so then your cores are set. But I'm going to delete that and just enable this whitelist of domains, which I will use for this example. The next option is csrf, and that is again a whitelist array of URLs from which your backend can accept cookies. This is just an extra layer of security that is highly recommended to be set, and I typically set this to be the same as my core's settings. So I'm just going to duplicate this and type in csrf, and this is done. The upload option is where you can set your payload-wide upload options. The primary reason you need to set this is if you want to limit the file size of uploaded documents. This needs to be written in bytes like this. So I'm going to add upload, and then in my upload, I'm going to create an object where I'm going to have limits, and then I'm going to put in file size and just say 5 million bytes. So this will limit whatever I upload across my entire PayloadCMS project to 5 million bytes only. The last option we'll go over in this video is the secret. This needs to be a secure string stored in your .env file that tells Payload what to use in password, salt, and hashing. Again, it's a required field, and your project will not run if you do not have it set up properly. This should have been created when you started a new project, but if not, this is how you'll do it. So if we scroll down, I know that secret was created. So we see the secret field here that's taking an environment variable from payload secret or returning an empty string if undefined. So if it's not there though, you'll see all of these red lines saying that something is broken in the config. You can come here, type in secret, and then just type in process.env.payload secret or empty string, comma, to make sure that this is formatted correctly. And that's it for extending the PayloadCMS config for now. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. There are many more fields in the payload config that we still haven't even gone over yet, but we will do that in a later video. The fields we have gone over will get you started and on your way to a more fully featured CMS. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and get notifications to make sure you're updated on all the content I'll be putting out about PayloadCMS and its extensibility. See you next time.